you very much, Andrew. It's fantastic to be here at Reform, and you have done brilliant work since 2001, talking about how we can't simply spend more money on public services, we also have to reform the way we operate, look at outcomes, and I know you've done particular work on criminal justice, and the government has looked very closely at it, and I believe a few of the ideas have been adopted, and I think you will see in the white paper we've outlined, we've been looking at some of those reform reports. And there is no area of the public sector in greater need of reform than our prisons. Every morning I receive a list of incidents across the estate, and it makes for grim reading. On October the 18th, that incident report included details of the attack in Pentonville, in which a prisoner fatally stabbed a fellow offender, Jamal Mahmood, and injured 2 others. This incident made the news. Many others did not. But on the same day, there were 3 staff assaults, 2 more offender stabbings, a prisoner found hanging by a ligature, fortunately cut down in time, and a cell fire. Of course, it's impossible to eliminate risk in a difficult environment like a prison. But the levels of violence and self-harm in our prisons are totally unacceptable, and I'm determined to turn the tide. For without safety, there can be no reform. Of course, it's right that the primary purpose of our prisons is punishment, to deprive criminals of their most fundamental right, freedom, and to protect the public by locking offenders away. But the plain fact is that most offenders will not be locked away forever. One day, they're going to be released back into our communities. And if prisons are places of drugs, gangs, and violence, then this will spill out into our society. I believe that creating prisons that are centres of reform is the logical choice for anyone determined to build a safer society and deliver more efficient public services. Whatever else could be said of our prisons at the moment, it cannot be said that they deliver a good deal for the taxpayer or do all they can to make society safer. As the number of first-time offenders reduces, something we should all be thankful for, the need for reform of the remaining rump becomes ever more pressing. Our reoffending rates have not shifted in a decade and amount to a 15 billion annual cost to society. That's a high price for failure, and the human cost is higher still. Almost half of former prisoners will commit another crime within a year of release. Another burglary, another mugging, another violent assault, all adding up to 100,000 plus crimes committed every year because prison isn't working. Prisons have a critical role to play in making society safer by cutting reoffending rates. And for that to happen, prisons need to transform into places of safety, of hard work, of discipline, and of self-improvement. Prison reform is hardly a new concept. I look around the room and I see great prison reformers. And after visiting prisons in 1819, the great social campaigner Elizabeth Fry warned that they were the very nurseries of crime and called for schools of virtue to be created in their stead. Throughout the 20th century, any number of reports have heralded advances in safety and standards in our estate. And yet here we are in the 21st century with some of the same buildings that housed offenders in Fry's day and prisons that remain the very nurseries of crime. There is no doubt, and we've just seen a film of some fantastic practice, that we do have inspired leadership, dedicated officers, and the support of charities, and we've seen pockets of innovation, challenge, and change take root. But comprehensive reform has not taken hold. And I think one of the problems is that Parliament has not been clear enough about the purpose of our prisons. We need to say that prisons, as well as depriving people of liberty, have to be about reforming offenders. And we need to say that both of those things are vital to make our society safer. In prison legislation, some of which dates back to 1877, the Secretary of State is accountable for providing enough places to house offenders. There is no mention of responsibility for making prisoners less likely to reoffend. And there are precious few clear mechanisms for the Secretary of State, or indeed the head of the prison service, to be held for account to which the state in which prisoners leave prison. That's why today's white paper, for the first time, establishes a clear vision and framework for our prison system and mechanisms by which the people responsible for delivering it can be held to account. For the first time, they make the Secretary of State accountable for the reform of offenders, not just providing them with prison places. For the first time, there'll be a formal trigger for the Secretary of State to intervene when a prison is failing. And for the first time, publicly available performance standards spanning a 3-year cycle will be set for each prison. They will chart how well prisons are doing in preparing offenders to live law-abiding lives when they get out. We know that prisoners are less likely to re-offend if they are free from drugs that fuel so much crime, that they have the basic education needed to work, and that there's a job for them to go to. So we'll set rigorous standards for each prison in this areas. We will test prisoners on entry into the prison system and on exit, and we'll publish a new league table of prisons to show how well each is doing in getting offenders off drugs, getting them into education and work, so that they can get a job and turn their lives around. New standards of public information will shine a light on our prison system. They'll expose the failures, highlight the successes, and drive improvements across the estate. At present, prisons are rather like schools in the 1970s and early 1980s, before the advent of the national curriculum, Ofsted and league tables. Jim Callaghan famously referred to the school curriculum as the secret garden. In 1980, when my parents were looking for schools for me, what qualified as a good school was based on word of mouth. People would gossip locally about which one had a good or a bad head teacher, where the pupils were playing truant or where they were hard at work. You would hear about maybe they had better results or they were better in sport. But you didn't know. There was no way of knowing which secondaries were turning out Oxbridge hopefuls and which were sending their pupils to join the dole queue. We now know all of that, and it would be unthinkable to go back. Prisons are more like secret bunkers than secret gardens. But the case for greater transparency and accountability is as overwhelming as it is overdue. So in future, governors will be given the powers to achieve reform, and they will be held to account for it in an open and transparent way. We'll start by measuring how well prisons do in tackling some of the most fundamental drivers of reoffending. Drugs are a major cause of crime, as offenders mug, burgle and steal to feed their habit. They are also the scourge of our prisons, fueling violence and thwarting reform. We've taken tough action to crack down on drugs in our prisons, including a nationwide rollout of mandatory drug tests for dangerous new psychoactive substances. But what we don't test for at the moment is the prison's progress in getting offenders off drugs. So we'll ensure offenders are tested when they come into prison and when they leave to drive improvements across the prison system in getting offenders off drugs. This is the first step towards a wider range of health measures. We're currently working with the Department of Health on a mental health strategy for prisons, which will include plans to measure how well prisons are doing in supporting offenders with mental health problems. And in the new year, Lord Farmer will publish a set of recommendations on strengthening family ties for those sent to prison. Having a stable family life to return to is a fundamental reason why some offenders choose to go straight on release rather than reoffending. We also know that getting a job on release dramatically cuts reoffending rates. And we know to get a job that basic maths and English skills are vital. Although the total number of prisoners participating in learning has increased since 2010, participation in maths and English has remained static. There are some great reading, writing and maths programmes in our prisons. I met some women offenders at HMP Bronzefield who were tackling percentages for the first time in their lives and told me how much better the experience was there than they found at school. I saw offenders at HMP Norwich getting to grips with BODMAS which they were very excited about. And they were motivated because they knew it would help them secure work, and prison officers at that prison had explained that to them and motivated them. But we want the pockets of good work to become the norm across the estate. So we'll be assessing how much progress has been made on teaching English and maths in every prison. We'll be developing a common curriculum for prisons in line with the Sally Coates recommendation, and we'll be saying more about this in the new year. We'll also be unveiling an employment strategy for prisons being led by Minister Gima to make sure offenders are getting training in the right skills for the modern jobs market and to meet employment needs in their local area. Too many prisoners are either getting no job training or they're spending time doing things like making mailbags. Instead, prisons should be training offenders on the inside for the jobs vacancies on the outside. For example, with our new house building programme, the construction industry is in need of skilled workers. Land Securities has 20 vacancies for scaffolders. So what they're doing at HMP Brixton is making sure that they're training the offenders to fill those jobs when they leave prison. We're working with major retailers, business leaders and charities on a package that will offer a step change in skills training in our prisons. I can also say today that it will include a new prisoner apprentice programme, offering offenders training on the inside that will count towards the completion of a formal apprenticeship on the outside. We'll be signing up some of the biggest names on the high street, and within British industry, we will be asking people to commit to taking on former offenders as apprentices for a minimum of 12 months on release. These are the first steps, but we will go on to build on these league tables to give public and Parliament a better understanding of how well our prisons are working. This is the foundation for comprehensive reform across the estate. League tables that chart not just how well prisoners protect the public and keep order inside, but how well they prepare prisoners for life outside. I recognise that we're asking governors to do a lot, but I also know how committed they are to the job and to turning lives around. And I want to make it clear that although we are setting high expectations on what we want prisons to deliver, we'll be giving governors much more flexibility over how they achieve it. Of course, there are areas like security, intelligence and extremism, where strong national leadership is required. But in reforming offenders, it is those who see them every day who can challenge and motivate them. It's the officer on the wing or the teacher in the education centre that gets the breakthrough, not the bureaucrat in Whitehall. So we will release governors and frontline staff from the pettifogging rules and head office micromanagement that stifles innovation. There are currently more than 46,000 pages of rules and regulations governing everything from the number of shower caps each prisoner can have, 2 if you were wondering, to the maximum size of bath mats in our jails. We will give governors control over their own budgets, taking the lead from the first 6 reform prisons that are already up and running. From April 2017, they'll be able to choose the behavioural programme that they believe will best challenge offenders' criminal tendencies. Governors will begin commissioning healthcare budgets jointly with local NHS managers in 2017. They'll gain control of education budgets in 2017, 2018. And they can start boosting their budgets by earning income for their prison and reinvesting it in their regimes. Governors can choose who will they have working around them by selecting their own senior management team instead of those decisions being made at head office. Over the weeks that I've been visiting prisons, I've been impressed and humbled by the dedication of prison officers. Officers like Wendy Fisher-McFarlane, who has dedicated her life to public service. Wendy's been a prison officer for 26 years, the last 18 of which she has walked the wings of HMP Brixton. She takes huge pride in her work to turn lives around. I want Wendy to know, I want all prison officers to know that they have my total backing and I care deeply about their safety. I was struck recently by how an officer described his job to me. He said, I'm a teacher, I'm a parent, I'm a nurse, I'm a police officer. These are really important jobs that do a huge service to our society, and we should have huge respect for the people that do them. And I want to make sure that we are attracting people to the job of prison officer and recognising it as the professional career that it deserves to be recognised as. But things have changed rapidly and dramatically in our prisons, as dangerous psychoactive substances have flooded them, fueling violence and holding back reform. I know the impact that current levels of violence are having on the morale of the front line. I know that prison officers want to be able to do so much more than police the wings and turn the keys. Lockdowns and restrictive regimes sap the morale of the front line, increase the frustration of the prison population, and break down relationships between officers and offenders that are vital for reform. It's why we've invested in body-worn cameras, why we've trained hundreds of sniffer jobs to detect dangerous new drugs. It's why we're working with mobile phone operators to block phones, and we're working with other government departments on combating the emerging new threat of drones. Frontline officers need more support, which is why we will provide an extra £104 million every year to hire 2,500 more officers, strengthening the front line and boosting staff levels. It's right that we recognise when a staffing structure that was suitable for the past is struggling in the present and must be strengthened for the future. These extra officers will help us crack down on the toxic cocktail of drugs, drones and mobile phones, imperiling the safety of offenders and staff alike and thwarting reform. Extra officers will make prisons safe and more secure by resolving the tension before violence breaks out, carrying out searches for weapons and drugs, and building relationships with offenders. We will also establish a new high-end intelligence task force staffed by experienced professionals that will share vital evidence across the estate. And so prisoners think twice before using violence to settle scores. We will work more closely with the wider justice system to punish any criminality in jails as energetically as outside the gates. Prison officers are by and large highly professional, dedicated, capable people, amongst the most valuable public servants. Our plans will improve their working conditions, offer them greater support, and put them at the heart of our reforms. We also hope it will persuade more of our experienced officers to stick with the prison service. At the same time, we will reinforce their numbers with new recruits. We will focus on our armed forces for new officers who can set offenders on the road to reform by sharing their attitudes to duty, discipline and self-improvement. There will also be a new scheme aimed at building a generation of apprentices who want to carve out a career in the prison service, and a new degree-level prison officer scheme modelled on Teach First. Programmes that will deliver the next generation of talented professionals. None of us, though, would look forward to working somewhere that is dilapidated and dated at best, and dirty and dangerous at worst. Nor do out-of-date prisons, with darkened corridors, cramped conditions and rat infestations, provide the most effective backdrop for reform. Our £1.3 billion building programme will see 10,000 places created in jails that are modern, efficient and designed to deliver a disciplined regime. No-fly zones will counter the aerial threat posed by illegal drone deliveries. Some of the worst performing jails will be closed. We rely heavily on our armies of public, private and charitable volunteers, our prison visitors and monitors, and the thousands of social enterprises that do so much to encourage offenders to do better. The new prisons will make it easier for all those outside the gates, including employers with vacancies to fill, to make effective contact with those inside. There will be better visitor centres and dedicated spaces, not just the library or chapel, to work, learn or train. Better workshops and classrooms, suitable accommodation for offenders spending their first night in custody will be put in place, because we know that is the time that self-harm is most likely. Our reforms will not bring results overnight, but they will establish a safe and disciplined prison estate for wholesale reform to take root. The Prison Safety and Reform White Paper is the first in a series of wider plans that will embed the same philosophy across the entire criminal justice system. At its heart is the principles of making our streets safer by reducing reoffending, intervening earlier to turn lives around, and getting offenders to quit crime for good. In the coming months, we will build on these proposals, outlining our plans for women offenders and young offenders dealing with the specific issues that they face. And we will look again at probation to make sure that the progress offenders make in prison continues through the gates and into society. It's vital that prisons and probation support all the hard-won success in cutting crime in this country. Since 1984, crime in England and Wales has fallen by 40%. We've got better at stopping people falling into a life of crime. We now must get better at helping offenders abandon crime once and for all. As our white paper proposals take hold, our stubbornly high reoffending rates will come down and society will be safer still. Only then can we say that we're giving the best possible protection to the public. Only then can we say that prisoners are getting the best chance of turning their lives around. Only then can we say that our prisons are working. Thank you.